Hello, people. So it's 12th of January now. This is actually the 13th anniversary of the Haiti earthquake. That's not what I'm speaking about. I'm just saying that in passing. But I haven't really made a video for, it must be 3 weeks now. So this is quite a long hiatus. The reason being, I've had sound issues on the laptop. I've been visiting my family for Christmas, so I've been busy at that time. It's difficult to upload a video when you're with other people. Um, so those are the reasons. Now I know the sound here will not be perfect. So some people might complain in the comments, "Oh, Nathan, the sound isn't great." Guys, I know that. I know it isn't perfect. But I have to just work with what I've got. Um, I've just tested it and I can hear it. It seems to be okay. It's not that loud, but I can hear it. So hopefully, if people hear what I can hear, that will suffice. So I do apologize that it isn't perfect, but I don't know what to do. The volume's at 100%. I've checked the speakers. It's a stream laptop, so I'm working with what I've got really. But I do think this is an important video to make. One of the big news items that's happened so far in 2023 is the event in Brazil. A lot's been happening in Brazil recently. Of course, Pele died just before the new year, so there was his state funeral. There was a presidential inauguration of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Of course, his second time getting into the presidency. Lula, of course, is a controversial and divisive figure in Brazil, greatly admired by many, but also controversial. He's been caught up in Operation Car Wash. I believe he actually had some prison time, but also seen by many as a compassionate centre-left figure. Um, I won't comment in too much detail about that because I can understand in a country like Brazil, it's a relatively new democracy. I think comparisons can be made to the Philippines in that sense. When you have new democracies, sometimes I think you can have a situation where the politics is more divisive as different factions perhaps find their feet. I don't know. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that politics isn't divisive in longer established democracies too, because of course it is. Politics is adversarial by nature. But a healthy democracy, you should have this side believes this side believes that, and let's see who can get a mandate from the people to govern. And then the other side holds them to account, and you have a free press to hold account to power. That's what democracy is. Democracy is not about getting exactly what we want. It isn't. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about democracy, that it's about getting exactly what you want. I mean, certainly this democracy, the United Kingdom, is not exactly what I want. I didn't vote for the Tories. They're in power. But why did I not complain? Why not did I not go out with a pitchfork? Because I accepted they got the mandate in the last general election. So that's how democracy works. It's about respecting the mandate, and it's about respecting others. So, of course, if you've been following the news, you'll know that a mob attacked parliamentary buildings, institutions in Brasilia. And the echoes with what happened in the United States on January the 6th, 2021 are incredible. Of course, no two countries are exactly alike. The precise circumstances will be different, but so much about it. The date, it's only 2 days off the second anniversary, and that is coincidence because both presidential inaugurations happen to be in January. Um, but the parallels are very strong, and I think it would be, you know, it would be difficult not to say something about that because it's such a similar situation. In both cases, you have a defeated right wing candidate, populist, Trump and Bolsonaro. In both cases, the right wing populist, Trump and Bolsonaro, are pushing unfounded conspiracy theories. In both cases, you have sore losers. Trump still doesn't accept that he lost. Bolsonaro never formally conceded defeat. So you have sore losers, basically. Now, I think this is a concerning thing because if it can happen in the United States and it can happen in Brazil, two major democracies, it can happen anywhere really. Um, And it's concerning. We see around the world, anger and resentment boiling over sometimes. For example, the unrest in Sri Lanka last year was a good example of that, and more recently in Peru. So this is not something that's unique to any one country. Most countries probably have some level of dissatisfaction. In Britain, we have all the strikes going on at the moment, but it hasn't yet reached a point of sort of anarchy on the streets and scenes reminiscent of those in Brasilia or Washington, D.C., thank goodness. But that, we shouldn't sort of be overly confident that it can't happen here. I mean, Britain's probably one of the most politically stable countries in the world in the sense that we've had peaceful transfers of power for centuries, many centuries, even longer than the United States. I mean, that's serious internal conflict in the United Kingdom, outside of the Troubles, that is. But within Great Britain, let's say, really you have to go back to the Jacobite risings of the 18th century. But I am quite concerned with the trajectory of some movements, the likes of QAnon, the Oath Keepers, and I'm not sure what the various groups in Brazil are calling themselves. I'm sure they will have some echoes to what's happening in the United States. Um, but it's concerning. I know Lula has called them fascists and said they will be brought to justice. Whether they're fascists or not, I don't know. I don't know enough about the politics to endorse that view or not, and perhaps some would say that's only inflaming things by calling them that. But the fact remains, they're showing a contempt for democracy. Brazil, like any country, isn't going to be perfect. I'm sure it's corruption, but there's no hard evidence that Lula didn't win the election. And I would take the same position that as I took with the whole situation in the United States. If there is serious evidence of election fraud, then Bolsonaro and his supporters can bring that to the judiciary. They can do it legally. And of course, Bolsonaro's condemned the violence, just as Trump did eventually. Took him long enough, but of course they're condemning it, and of course they're distancing themselves from it. This is a typical tactic of demagogues. They stir up the hornet's nest, and then they wash their hands of it. And by the way, I think every individual is responsible for their own actions. So, if people are making a decision, storming the buildings, sometimes using violence, I understand, for example, in Brasilia, a mounted police officer was pulled off his horse and beaten up with sticks. So it was violent. No one died, but it's alarming. It is concerning to see this developing in democracies. We're not talking here about failed states. We're talking about established democracies. So, what's the answer? Well, I think that often when we think of the culture wars, we think of Western Europe and the United States. Apparently, they're quite a big thing in Brazil as well, from what I gather. And I think both sides fuel one another. So, on one hand, you have the woke left, and I've made no secret of my total contempt for the way of thinking. Okay, I've just come back from Waterstones, just had a coffee there, and there was a book by June Sarpong. I was surprised actually. I always thought she was, from what I know of her, she always seemed rather reasonable. But of course, it was about white privilege. So you have a black writer talking about white privilege and how we can empower white people to be allies, and that would be all very well. But it's this contentious woke term of white privilege, which I despise. I think it is a racist term. I think it's also very, very flawed in terms of actual accuracy because it's lumping all people one and the same. But anyway, I don't. I've spoken about that before. That my position, it's obnoxious, and it doesn't build bridges. Um, but it's out there. This sort of narrative that you get from the woke left. Um, but ironically, June Sarpong, unless I'm mistaken, had actually been in the series with the former governor Jesse Ventura on conspiracy theories. So I always thought she actually gravitated more to the right, but I guess I'm wrong. But I don't know. I mean, it's two extremes because I can say a lot about the woke left and the way of thinking. I do think they're hypocrites. I think they're deeply divisive. I think they're not above some rather nasty tactics, and I really, really have no time for that ideology. But I've also seen a very ugly side to the right, and I have to say, from what I gather, the right, these sort of unhinged conspiracy theories tend to be more the domain of the right. Now, I know that talking about conspiracy theories can get people wound up. They'll say, "Oh, that's just a way to dismiss opinions." Well, I do not say that every example of questioning power or official versions of events always a conspiracy theory, and let's just laugh at them. That's not what I'm saying. Okay, I think it's completely legitimate for people to think for themselves, to ask questions, to think critically. That's all good. The problem is with this trajectory that we see with the likes of QAnon and so on. It goes down a path where there's no critical thinking, and it sort of presents as worldview. When a forum that I'm on, someone presented this story about what happened in Brazil, and there were Americans and Canadians there basically justifying it and saying, "Oh well, it's the globalists trying to take over. It's just people taking back power." Well, what about the millions of Brazilians who voted for Lula? What about their rights, their democratic mandate? You know, I mean, how do we address problems like this? Because simply telling them they're wrong and they're idiots won't help. Obviously, I think um, I'm somewhere in the middle. I mean, I don't really endorse this idea that oh, you just need to reason with them. That a lot of these people are beyond reason. I do think it's pretty much cult-like. When you look at the likes of the Oath Keepers, for example, you can't reason with that mindset. If you see the sort of things that go on, you cannot reason with people who are convinced that all mainstream media is just a big concoction of lies, where all official institutions are corrupt and need to be torn down. I don't see how you can reason with someone whose worldview is so dystopian and so cynical. Um, I mean, they will never question their own sources. This is what I dislike about conspiracy theories. They say the rest of us are sheep and the rest of us are ignorant, but they never question their own sources. They never step back and think, well, I'm believing this source, but why is it that this is right and the BBC is wrong or whatever it is? So, they boast about critical thinking, but I would turn it around and say, well, are you really critically thinking? Or are you just, you know, you're doing what you accuse others of? Um, but worse than that is, you could believe that all the mainstream media is lies and all the rest of it. But when they start acting, and sometimes it turns to violence, very obnoxiously recently, there was a group in the UK who were actually basically stalking the survivors of the Manchester terror attack. It was featured on Panorama, and this guy was actually filming outside the survivor's house to try and prove that she wasn't really in a wheelchair, which was rubbish. She was, but he claimed it was a public street. That's meaty mouth way of basically justifying his obnoxious actions. When he was challenged, of course, he had no answers. So they think they've got a right to ask questions and scrutinize others. But when the questions turn on them, they can't take it. So it's quite obnoxious behavior. Um, I was quite disgusted by that, I have to say. So this sort of mentality is breeding out there. But I think that the woke left, and for want of a better term, the conspiracy pushing right, they fuel one another. Because the outrageous positions of the woke left, the sort of things they demand, where, you get this purging of culture, you get this sort of, oh, we need to erase any connection with the British Empire or racism as they see it. And just this erasure campaign, this sort of cultural revolution, that works up a lot of people. It works up a lot of reasonable minded people on the centre. But I think what partly happened. And I don't think that the reactionary right, the sort of conspiracy pushing right, is necessarily motivated by the woke left. I think they're more thinking about governments and media institutions and so on. But I do think both sides fuel one another. So the woke left will say, "Oh, these fascists are on the rise. We need to stand up against them." But then the right will say, "It's the far left that are on the rise. We need to stand up against them." And as far as I'm concerned, both sides are a problem. Both sides are intolerant. Both sides are not immune to violence. Both sides have engaged in violence. Um, and I'm not so naive as to say, oh, well, we should all just get on with each other and, agree to disagree. Politics is adversarial. But I think that there has to be a way to show dissent and anger without storming buildings or without trying to legislate on speech, um, at least as little as possible. I think the only time the speech should be legislated on is if it's clearly inciting violence, or defamatory. It's pushing lies about someone, for example, proven lies. But there is another side, of course, to all of this. I mean, I can say I abhor what these conspiracy people do. I do. And I think it's disgraceful the way they behave and the narrowness of their logic. But it would be wrong to totally dismiss it, because I do think at the same time institutions need to understand that if people do not feel empowered, and this is no justification for what happened in America and Brazil, none at all, but if people feel they don't have a voice, anger will build. I mean, I feel a lot of resentment towards our legal establishment. I think for the most part it's massively out of touch. I think so much more can be done. I think the legal system is bureaucratic, in terms of providing help to victims. I think, when you have a situation, for example, in the United Kingdom, where judges are not accountable, and they're not, they're really not. There's no way that an ordinary person could say, I think this person's abusing their power. The only way a judge in England and Wales can be disciplined is if, for example, it's professional misconduct. Let's say they're messing around with a juror or something like that. But there is absolutely no way for them to be held to account if they are consistently issuing sentences that the vast majority of people just don't agree with and think are completely absurd. I think that anonymity and that gap between the legal establishment and the public is a serious problem. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to see anarchy and we're going to see people invading courtrooms, but it does breed anger. It breeds anger. So I think institutions, whether it be governments, powerful media outlets, you name it, they have to make sure that that gap, doesn't get wider and wider. They have to understand how ordinary people think. And a big part of that is transparency. A big part of that is communication. Um, so, for example, the legal establishment in this country can be a hell of a lot more transparent. They can make it easier for people to complain about weak judges. Why? Because they're in a position of power, because they're making decisions about people's lives and affecting people's lives. So the public should have a much greater say on it. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that everything is conducted by populism. But they say one man's populism is another man's listening to the people, right? And there's definitely truth in that. So I have concerns. I mean, I have concerns about the way this sort of right wing faction, I'm not going to say the right. As I was debating with someone on this the other day, she was trying to claim that conservatives feel this way. And I said, well, actually, not all conservatives. There's reasonable conservatives who condemn this behavior. And there's reasonable left wing people who can see the intolerance of woke ideology. But I do think extremes are rising, in part because of a perception, and it may be a false perception, but I think there is some truth in it, that institutions are out of touch. Um, I mean, take for example with COVID and the vaccine situation. Um, I don't have much time for anti-vaxxers, but I think that their views are galvanized when you have overreach. And I do think, if we're being honest, there was serious overreach during the pandemic. When you had overzealous police officers arresting people outside their own homes and stuff like that. I do think it was overzealous. And I do think there was people, it has to be said, some in the medical profession, some elsewhere, who were overly keen on excessive lockdown and excessive restrictions on liberty, and they seem to think it was perfectly fine. Now, what I think the attitude most people took, myself included, was it was a temporary necessity. And thank goodness it's over now, because I think there's no justification for stripping away basic liberties for an extended period of time. And I do consider, for example, mandatory mask wearing to be that. But, you had people who were just pushing falsehoods about what that involved. And I think, there was overreach and there was paranoia on the part of, we hear about fake news. I'll probably get something on this video saying, about vaccines, even though, by the way, YouTube, if you're listening, I'm not saying anything against them. So I think overreach and I think excessive control of people's lives definitely fuels these sort of conspiracies. Definitely. So that's why I say we can't totally dismiss them because there has been attacks, frankly, on civil liberty in the Western world in recent years. We can't deny it. It has. Freedom of speech is not absolutely guaranteed. It should be, but it isn't. There have been too many attempts to legislate speech. So what I would close with on this video, something to think about, is that when the extremes are rising, the right and the left, institutions have to take note, and centrists like me have to take note. We have to say, this isn't going to be contained by just laughing at these people or ridiculing them or criticizing them. Although I do think they deserve criticism if they act like they did in Brasilia. But institutions have to listen to the people. Empowerment of ordinary people is so important. Now, just one last thing, by the way, Keir Starmer was recently talking about empowering local councils. But it's kind of a double-edged sword because on one hand, it sounds democratic. It sounds like, oh, that's giving more power back to local areas. But maybe people don't want to see little mini dictators taking over councils. And my concern about that is you'll get predominantly Labour councils will be overzealous. They'll come out with a lot of petty rules, trying to control people's lives. So more local power isn't necessarily more democracy for people. More local power might mean precisely that, more local power for local bureaucrats. Well, how's that any different from, the power of the government? So I'm not 100% convinced about that. Not if it means putting power into petty officialdom. Um, Yeah. Okay, people, this was a bit longer because there was a lot to cover, but that's my feelings about it. I hope the sound isn't awful, and Happy New Year to everyone. I hope you all have a good 2023, and thanks for watching.